In the year 977 AD, somewhere between the flicker of candlelight and the scent of damp stone walls, a quiet crisis was brewing, not in a palace or a battlefield, but in a pottery shed. A simple crack in a kettle would ripple through entire villages. Tonight, you'll hear how a shortage of humble clay pots slowly brought a kingdom to the brink of boiling point. So settle in, close your eyes if you like, and drift into a forgotten corner of history, where even a chipped kettle could shape the fate of a feast. Chapter 1. A Fragile Inconvenience. Clay, fire, and the foundations of daily life. It was not war, nor plague, nor the collapse of empire that first disrupted the fragile rhythms of the Kingdom of Wessex in the late 10th century, but a quiet, crumbling inconvenience. The sudden disappearance of reliable clay kettles. The year was 977 AD. You may imagine that in such a time, the greatest burdens of daily life lay in matters of survival: grain harvests, Viking raids, taxes, illness. And in many ways, you'd be correct. But tucked beneath the weight of kings and conflicts was a subtler crisis, one that spread from hearth to hearth. Potters' kilns were failing, and the simple clay vessels used by almost every household, especially the squat-bellied kettle used for boiling water, brewing alewort, or making gruel, had begun to break, crack, or simply vanish from the markets. Wessex, a kingdom in southern England and the heartland of the House of Alfred, was a region deeply reliant on artisanal production. From Dorset to Hampshire, potters had worked their craft in wood-fired kilns, using earthenware clay drawn from local deposits. These kettles, often with rope-handled sides, thick rims, and soot-blackened bottoms, had long been taken for granted by rich and poor alike. But beginning in the spring of 977, complaints filtered in from abbey kitchens and peasant cottages alike. The pots were weak. They cracked when first placed on hot coals. They chipped when stirred. They were simply not lasting. No single moment announced this inconvenience. It crept in gradually, like damp into stone. The Abbey of Glastonbury wrote in its kitchen ledger that 24 pots were fetched, yet only 6 served a full week. A house steward in Winchester recorded that 3 newly made kettles split by heat before the stew had even thickened. More tellingly, monasteries, then the centers of literacy and economic record, began to mention rising costs for replacements and increasing delay in supply. What had gone wrong? The problem, as traced by modern historians and archaeologists, appears to have been geological and slightly bureaucratic. The clay deposits commonly used in southern Wessex, rich in iron and sand, were both resilient and abundant. But sometime in the mid-970s, several primary extraction sites near modern-day Wiltshire were exhausted or waterlogged. Local abbots, having granted those lands for sheep grazing or timber rights, were slow to notice the downstream effects. Meanwhile, the secondary clay beds had a different mineral composition, slightly higher in chalk and less tolerant of heat shock. Fired in the same low-temperature kilns used for decades, these new vessels were brittle. Worse still, a recent law under King Edward the Martyr, a modest regulation intended to discourage trade monopolies, had placed restrictions on inter-parish pot exchanges. Intended to curb rising market prices and keep goods locally sourced, it accidentally prevented higher quality pots from reaching parishes that had lost their primary clay sources. And so, the very households that needed sturdy kettles the most, rural villages, traveling brewers, nuns feeding the poor, found themselves stuck with inferior ware. But why did this matter so much? You must imagine daily life at the time, not as a stream of grand events, but as a chain of small dependencies. Nearly every process of nourishment began with boiling, not just cooking, but purifying water, steeping barley, washing cloth, softening roots. Without a working kettle, a household could not function. This wasn't simply a culinary nuisance. It disrupted health, hygiene, and survival. Monks who could not boil linseed or nettle were more prone to sores. villagers unable to steep barley, could not brew weak ale, the common alternative to often contaminated well water. There's a surviving letter from an abbess near Sherborne, dated around the autumn of 977. It reads, "Translated from Old English, we have no pots left whole. The steward has fetched 3 from Mere, but none do last more than the feast of Saint Ealdred. Our sick brothers must drink only cold water, and the children do weep for broth." This wasn't poetic exaggeration. Clay kettles had always broken from time to time, but this was different. This was a kettle famine, and yet, unlike famines of food, this crisis attracted little urgent attention. Why? Because it was small, domestic, and, to those outside the hearth, unremarkable. Kings did not draft edicts about kettle shortages. The scribes of the royal court were preoccupied with succession troubles and church property disputes. It would take months before anyone in a position of authority even considered that something as mundane as a pot shortage might have ripple effects across the economy. In the meantime, people adapted. Improvised solutions arose. Some began repurposing old iron cauldrons, though these were rare and rusted quickly. Others borrowed from neighbors or pooled what remained in common halls. Certain abbeys returned to earlier Roman techniques, trying to boil in bronze bowls over indirect flame, often with mixed results. Rural women, who bore the brunt of this inconvenience, developed techniques for slower boiling and thicker porridge that required less vessel durability, but clay was more than just material. It was a rhythm of feeding, sharing, healing, and preparing. The sudden loss of this quiet instrument disturbed something deeper, the assurance that daily life, though hard, was at least dependable, and so the humble clay kettle became, in 977, a symbol of deeper uncertainties. If even pots could no longer be trusted, what else might crack beneath the surface? Chapter 2. Cracks in the Hearth. How a pot shortage strained the kingdom of Wessex. When the problem of the breaking kettles deepened in late 977 AD, what began as a quiet inconvenience started to press against the larger bones of society. The kingdom of Wessex, though no stranger to famine, raids, or dynastic feuds, was unprepared for the slow erosion of daily function from something so small, so domestic, so seemingly beneath the notice of kings: the failing of clay pots. In some ways, the silence around the issue was what made it so dangerous. The clay kettle was so woven into the background of daily life that its failure produced no immediate decree, no emergency council. But through abbey corridors, village cookfires, and market stalls in towns like Wilton and Shaftesbury, you could hear the same quiet complaints, or see the results in silent gestures. Women scrubbing cracked pots with sour expressions, monks stirring broth in dented bronze, and elderly tenants paying double for a half-fired vessel at market. At the heart of the issue were the local economies, both formal and informal, that relied on reliable clayware to function. Wessex, at this time, was largely a barter economy. While silver pennies did circulate, most daily exchanges were done through goods or labor. A woman might trade 2 firkins of ale for a bolt of coarse wool, or offer bread in exchange for smoked herring. Central to this system was the humble ale, often boiled, lightly fermented, and far safer than most standing water. But to brew alewort, one needed kettles. And as the clay cracked, so too did the supply of ale. What followed in early 978 was not famine, but thirst. Markets began reporting dry weeks, during which no fresh ale was available for trade. With water often unsafe, especially in crowded town centers, this caused discomfort and occasional outbreaks of stomach illness. Bakeries slowed their output, since warm ale was often used in dough proofing. Monks at Peterborough recorded an increase in abdominal sickness that spring, while village priests began quietly requesting small iron cauldrons from more prosperous parishes. These were in short supply. Worse still was the toll on communal kitchens. Monasteries across Wessex had long-run alms kitchens, daily meals given to the poor, the sick, or travelers. At the Abbey of Malmesbury, the refectory had once fed nearly 200 mouths per day, using 6 large clay kettles to prepare stews. By midsummer, only 2 remained functional. A kitchen brother there wrote in a margin, "They crack as if touched by frost, yet the flame is no stronger than last year." Even the fabric of social care began to show stress. Without the ability to boil herbs for medicine or broth for the infirm, sickbeds became more miserable. Several elderly tenants, many of whom relied on charity from the church, were recorded as gone without warming since Lammas. Priors, often too embarrassed to escalate such a seemingly minor issue, began requesting donations of iron pots through back channels, or repurposing broken ceramics with iron hoops and leather sealing. A messy, short-lived solution at best. Meanwhile, the potters themselves were overwhelmed and defensive. In village potteries outside Frome and Amesbury, clay was hauled from more distant quarries with lower mineral consistency. Firings required more wood and time. Kilns often failed under the stress. The master potter of Gillingham was quoted in a rare surviving letter as saying, "We fire 6 days and lose 4. There's no surety in this earth." Some even accused the potters of fraud, watering clay, under-firing, or cutting costs. This was mostly unfair. In truth, the potters were caught. Between dwindling resources, new regulations, and rising demand. But the damage to their reputations stung. In the small village of Tidworth, one potter was briefly accused of witchcraft for the rapid breakage of his wares, an echo of older superstitions tied to domestic ruin. The crisis reached a strange turning point that autumn when, during a small synod at Sherborne, the Bishop of Ramsbury raised the issue, not in theological terms, but logistical ones. His monastic scribes had compiled a list of the abbey's non-recoverable costs due to the clayware failures: lost food, rising medical expenses, and reduced alms. The total was significant enough to be noticed. In response, a peculiar and now largely forgotten edict was issued: the provision of vessel relief for ecclesiastical kitchens, essentially a short-lived policy allowing monasteries to requisition kettles or cauldrons from adjacent parishes in times of shortage. It also granted temporary permission for certain abbeys to import pots from across the Thames, notably from Mercia, where clay reserves were more stable and firing techniques better preserved from Roman traditions. It was a rare case of a domestic inconvenience reaching the ears of power. But outside the church, relief came slowly in response to desperation. Households began adopting creative, if makeshift, solutions. Some cooked directly on flat stones, heating thin stews that required no vessel walls. Others roasted instead of boiling. Wooden buckets were lined with pitch or bark in an attempt to heat water near flame, though this often ended with scorched walls or splinters in the broth. A few even tried suspending water skins over coals, a Roman-era technique mentioned. In older texts, though results were mixed and often laughable, these improvisations became part of folklore. One tale from Dorset, preserved in local rhyme, speaks of Mother Ettle's wobbling kettle, a pigskin hung on a broomstick that boiled barley to the taste of soap and ash. Whether true or not, it captured the quiet absurdity of the moment. How even the serious business of survival had been reduced to experimentation and mild embarrassment. By early 979, a slow recovery had begun. New kiln designs, taller, better insulated, were introduced by potters in Berkshire. Clay from a quarry near Pusey, long thought too silty, proved adaptable with double firing. And the Crown, newly stabilized under King Fellard, quietly rescinded some of the restrictive trade laws that had hampered inter-parish commerce. But the social cracks left behind would take longer to mend. Trust in local potters remained bruised. Abbey kitchens, once generous with their meals, became more cautious. And households, once accustomed to a quiet reliability in their clayware, now eyed every new kettle with suspicion, listening not. for the simmer of stew, but the first telltale sound of a crack. Because once a pot betrays you, it's hard to boil the same way again. Chapter 3. The Sound of Simmering Clay. How Wessex quietly solved a crisis no one wanted to talk about. By the year 980 AD, the worst of what later chroniclers would not even call a crisis had passed. No battles had been fought. No statues toppled. No great reforms announced. Yet the Clay Kettle Crisis, as it would come to be known in a few rare scribal notes centuries later, quietly shaped how the people of late 10th century Wessex cooked, traded, and trusted the earth beneath their feet. The first noticeable change was in silence. There were no proclamations of victory. But slowly, the marketplaces grew less tense. Conversations returned to the price of eels and the sudden rise in goose feathers. The smell of ale returned to the air outside taverns and bakehouses. Even the poor were seen once again lining up at abbey kitchens with wooden bowls in hand, hopeful for a warm ladle of broth, no longer served lukewarm from borrowed iron or burned over flat stones, but bubbling from freshly fired kettles. How had this quiet resolution come about? The answer, as with so many things in history, was not one solution, but many small ones stitched together across parish boundaries, through stubborn tradition, hesitant innovation, and more than a little trial and error. One major turning point was the formation of informal potters' guilds. Although not yet recognized as formal trade guilds, a handful of master potters from Wiltshire, Berkshire, and Dorset began meeting, often at candlelit inns or monastery workshops, to share firing methods, clay mixing ratios, and kiln repairs. These meetings were neither sanctioned nor especially organized, but they represented a first step toward standardization. From these meetings came a new method, the double fire technique, in which kettles were first green-fired, a lower temperature process to stabilize the clay, cooled, and then refired with a thicker slip glaze to seal microcracks. Though more time-consuming, the results were significantly more durable. Breakage rates fell by nearly half over the following 2 years, according to records kept at Glastonbury Abbey's pottery ledger. Another subtle but powerful change came with the regulation of clay collection. Prior to the crisis, most potters simply dug clay from whatever soil was near, often mixing silts, sands, and even old ash into the batch. But under growing pressure, monastic stewards began recording clay sources and categorizing them by durability. A simple system emerged. Red stone clays from Pusey Vale were given first preference. Yellow loams from Tidcombe were only used for shallow bowls or non-boiling vessels. It was an early form of quality control, emerging not from royal decree, but local necessity. Then there were the social customs that shifted. Households, once proudly self-reliant, became more community-oriented when it came to clay. In small villages like Lacock or Woolston, it became common for a single kiln to be shared among several families. Firings were coordinated, wood was pooled, and successes were celebrated communally. The potter, once a solitary figure scraping by, was elevated to something like a village engineer, one whose survival ensured everyone else's simmering stew. Culturally, the crisis also left its fingerprints. Several surviving leech books, medieval medical texts, include marginal notes about not boiling herbs in cracked clay, and recipes for cough draughts often specify stout-fired vessels. The crisis had affected medicine. Similarly, records from Winchester's cathedral kitchen showed the acquisition of 2 bronze kettles as backup, the first recorded instance of diversifying cookware in a monastic inventory. The kitchen, long thought of as a place of simplicity, now had to think in terms of resilience. Of course, not every area recovered equally. In poorer rural parishes far from trade routes, cracked vessels remained common well into the early 980s. In some cases, foreign wares, especially imported jugs from Francia or earthen pots from Mercia, began to appear in border markets. This trickle of imports helped ease the pain but also served as a quiet humiliation. To rely on the foreign for something as basic as boiling water, even the crown, now led by the young and hesitant Fellard II, later known as the Unready, issued a muted acknowledgement of the crisis. Though no direct law was ever passed regarding kettles, a surviving scroll from 981 references merchant wares for kitchen use exempt from inland toll, suggesting that clay pots were, for a short time, given trade priority, an unspoken nod to their earlier absence. But perhaps the most enduring outcome was not found in legislation or pottery, but in trust. The crisis had taught the people of Wessex something deeply uncomfortable, that their daily survival depended not on grand battles or royal lineage, but on the small, overlooked things, like clay, water, and flame. A pot breaking was no longer just a pot breaking. It was a reminder that civilization was only as strong as its quietest tools. From this came caution. Families began storing a spare kettle. Abbeys kept back stock in hidden shelves. Some scribes even penned short prayers to accompany firings, part ritual, part superstition, all grounded in the memory of those hungry months. And slowly, the story faded. The Clay Kettle Crisis never entered the great chronicles. No poet sang of it in the halls of nobles. But if you look closely, in the margins of abbey cookbooks, the soot marks of old kill ledgers, or the sturdy design of 11th century English cookware, you can still see its traces. A line of adaptation, curved like the handle of a humble pot, because sometimes history is not made by fire and sword, but by the soft sound of water simmering again after a long, uncertain silence. And so, that's how a cracked kettle and a quiet panic over pots simmered gently through history, barely remembered, but never quite forgotten. If you found yourself drifting off, or just enjoying the slow unraveling of a very boring problem, I'm glad you were here. If stories like this help you unwind, rest, or even fall asleep, I invite you to gently tap the like button. And if you'd like more sleepy histories whispered your way, consider subscribing to Quite Boring Sleep. There are many more uneventful tales waiting in the corners of the past, and I'd love to tell them to you. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night and sweet dreams.